Greetings, adventurers. You're listening to The Quiet Journeys of Professor Atwood with me, Professor Atwood. I'm glad you're here, and I can't wait to tell you about my latest journey. Don't worry, it's a safe space. I'll handle all the danger for you. I designed these stories to help you relax, chill anxiety, and go to sleep. Maybe they'll even put a smile on your face, even if it's a sleepy smile. So please, settle in, relax, and prepare to quietly drift off with me to parts known, unknown, and even some places in between. Comfortable? Very well. Let's get underway. Good evening, adventurers. I hope you're doing well. I also hope you're all cozy and settled in because tonight I'm going to tell you about the big day. That's right, this evening's story is going to be all about blasting off into outer space and an unexpected obstacle in getting there. Now, as you remember from last time, the crew took a tour of my spacecraft, the Journeyman, except of course for Barry, our flight commander, and Kara, our flight engineer, who were already there prepping for launch. The preparations had gone quite smoothly, and they were able to get everything prepped and ready for launch, including moving the Journeyman to the secret launch pad and rocket gantry by the Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena. Final preparations and final inspections had all been concluded, and we were ready for launch. The crew was also thoroughly enjoying the lattes at the rocket gantry coffee shop, the White Dwarf. And they were right, you couldn't beat the lattes there, or the view, for that matter. It was a good place to take a break and reflect on the journey ahead. They had just received a new batch of scones by helicopter, so we knew they were fresh. Honestly, I'm a bit particular about my scones. I like a classic blueberry or orange one. Once they start to fancy them up with chocolate chips and frosting, well then it's just a hard donut. Anyway, to each his own, and all the different flavors of scones went quickly, except for the currant ones, as I've never seen anyone eat one of those. I will tell you all about the launch, an unexpected complication, and some cryptic mission reveals in a moment. But first, I need to tell you about a few things. I want to mention again the note about our stories. They are designed for you to drift in and out of, and while yes, I do like to tell you a full story every episode, drifting in and out or falling completely asleep is factored into the equation. You can pick things up anywhere, as that's why I do the story recaps at the beginning. And if you're here, awake, and hanging on every word, well, again, I'm flattered, and we try to add additional flourishes and flavor in there just for you. So by all means, enjoy the show any way you wish. It's scientifically designed that way. No rules and no pressure, adventurers. I'd also like to have you rate the show with a bunch of stars. Reviews are great too, and it's always nice to read pleasant things about what we're doing over here. And this is also very important. Don't forget to spread the word and tell your friends about the show and post about it wherever you post about things. The more adventures per night, the merrier. Now, before I mention the White Cat Adventures Club, I want to remind you that we have created a Science and Adventure Helper donation link on the homepage. So just go to whitecatentertainment.com and click Donate for a one-time donation. But if you do want more, there's the White Cat Adventures Club. You can get sometimes early access and ad-free listening to all the shows and an exclusive look at my very irregular journal. Science and exploring is expensive, and your support helps make it happen. And for just $5 a month, you can show your support for the show. There are different tiers with different rewards, including an exclusive t-shirt. please go to patreon.com/whitecatentertainment and enjoy the access your way. Oh, and one last reminder, Bradley and I take a much-needed vacation twice a year, once in December and once in July, so there will only be one show in those months. Do not adjust your podcast player. This is normal and by design. Please enjoy the rest of the show library in the meantime, or perhaps go on your own journey as well. All right, let's get back to the story. The final inspections were complete, and everyone had now toured the Journeyman, and we were finishing up our coffee, tea, and scones at the White Dwarf in the rocket gantry. Everyone was excited and just buzzing with anticipation for tomorrow's launch. Barry, our flight commander, was preparing the flight logs as he sipped a mocha latte. Kara was reviewing the launch bay vehicle schematics, and while she got why there were drones and a rover, she asked why there was a boat pod in the launch bay. I smiled and said you never know when and where you'll find a large body of water that needs exploring. She nodded, but I don't think she was completely convinced. Stephen was brushing up on various languages, including the Universal Pantomime language, and found a Martian language database, but was having trouble deciphering it. I told him not to worry too much about it, as the human mouth was unable to make most of the sounds of the Martian language anyway. He asked if we would be using UPL exclusively then, and I laughed and said no, the Martians speak English, except for the royalty. But then Janet gave me a side glance, and it looked like this was a discussion best saved for later. Bradley was making sure everyone had everything they needed and ordered another round of scones. Bradley and I had a shorthand, and I knew he had everything under control. Aaron, our retired Air Force medic, seemed very relaxed, and I was once again reminded of his complexity. He was an imposing figure, over 6 feet tall with a chiseled physique and an eye patch, and he was possibly even too tall for NASA, who liked their astronauts between 62 and 75 inches. I mean, I didn't measure him, of course. It wasn't necessary. And also, you don't want to make it weird right before a space launch. The Journeyman could accommodate all builds, sizes, and physiques, so it was a moot point. Jillian, our space chef, had appreciated the Journeyman's roomy galley and mess hall, and was making last-minute food supply lists, including spices and condiments. Janet said she would take care of it, as long as she had the final lists in the next hour or so. Dolores, our security officer/mercenary, was taking it all in, and I could tell she was enjoying herself and warming to the crew. She was still casually vigilant, and looked for signs of tension between Barry and Janet, who seemed to have an as-of-yet unrevealed history together. I knew she was still a bit concerned as to whether her astrophobia would kick in after launch, and was worried it would impair her performance. I personally wasn't worried, and knew Janet had loaded extra support modules into the Journeyman's computer database, and Aaron would be there to support her as well. And of course, she had Bradley, who would go to the ends of the earth for her. Although, ironically, we were going past the ends of the earth, but I'm sure the sentiment held, no matter where in the universe we ended up. Professor Armstrong from JPL joined us and asked us if we needed anything. I told him we had everything we needed and were looking forward to the launch. Professor Armstrong then looked a little troubled for a moment and asked if we could speak privately. It was good timing, as everyone had finished up their coffee, tea, and scones, and it was time for everyone to retire and get a good night's sleep before blastoff, bright and early the next morning. The crew departed, and I hung back for a moment to speak with Professor Armstrong. I asked what was troubling him. He said it was nothing to be alarmed about just yet, but there was a potential problem with the launch. There was a storm front coming, and while it was expected to get to Pasadena after the launch, you never know. I asked how bad it was, and he said pretty bad, and due to its intensity, if it hits at the wrong time, it could delay the launch for a week or more. Needless to say, I did not like the sound of that. I would have to give it some thought and come up with some kind of contingency plan. I thanked Professor Armstrong for bringing this to my attention, took a last sip of my English breakfast tea, and went home. When I arrived back at my home lab, I finished up some last-minute packing and had originally planned to go to bed early. Of course, that was before Professor Armstrong made me aware of a potential show-stopping weather problem. It may be fine, and the storm front could roll in as scheduled after the launch. But I couldn't count on that. I needed to come up with a solid contingency plan, and I needed to do it immediately. After going over possible scenarios and solutions in my mind, I came to the conclusion that only one was viable, and I couldn't do it alone. I had to call in a favor. Now, like I said before, normally I don't like calling in favors, but this time I didn't mind due to the size of the potential issue and our long working relationship. I spent the next few hours working out the logistics of calling in that favor and putting it on standby, depending on the weather. I wouldn't know if it was needed or not until tomorrow, so there was nothing left to do but go to bed. The problem was, I wasn't tired. I always find it a little difficult to sleep the night before an epic adventure, so I decided to take an evening walk in my garden. The gentle sounds of the occasional cricket and a lazy breeze whistling through the garden was all that I heard, and it relaxed me. The evening was once again pleasantly cool, and there was a full moon overhead. I looked up at the sky and the stars and thought about the journey ahead. It's not every day you get to go into space, and while this adventure still had many unanswered questions, I couldn't help but feel excitement for the journey ahead. What would we find? What happened to the previous Mars mission and my son? What was Janet not telling us? And would the Martian royalty remember me? But even with all these questions, I felt at peace, because starting tomorrow, I would be getting the answers to a lot of these questions. I took a deep breath and continued to tour my garden. My gardener, Paul, had done an excellent job as usual, and he had added a topiary rocket with a lighted cockpit in honor of our trip tomorrow. He planted red and white roses around it to represent Mars and the stars we would see along the way. I sat on a bench and took another deep breath. I took in the space topiary before me and smiled. My body relaxed and I sank deeper into the comfortable padded bench. The topiary cockpit light blinked warmly, and I thought about being inside the journeyman's actual cockpit starting tomorrow morning. There's a specific type of calmness and tranquility you can only find in outer space, and I was looking forward to experiencing it again. I sat and relaxed for another 30 minutes and then went to bed. By then, I was finally tired, and I drifted off to sleep and dreamed of spaceflight, journeys to the stars, and astronaut ice cream. The next morning I woke up and could not wait to get to the launch pad. It was time for the space launch, and while I had been to space a fair amount of times already, the excitement before a launch never diminishes. While the storm front was a concern, and getting closer, it looked like it would not get to Pasadena until after the launch. Things were looking good, and I just smiled from ear to ear and thought about what a special event a space launch was. You see, a space launch is the earliest part of a flight that reaches space. Space launch involves liftoff when a rocket or other space launch vehicle leaves the ground at the start of a flight. Liftoff is of two main types: rocket launch, the current conventional method, and non-rocket space launch, where other forms of propulsion are employed, including air-breathing jet engines and other kinds. Now, some of these are new and experimental, like space catapults and railguns, and obviously we would be using a traditional rocket launch. It is important to note here that there is no clear boundary between Earth's atmosphere and space, as the density of the atmosphere gradually decreases as the altitude increases. However, scientists, and quite often the government, don't really like things being vague, so there are several standard boundary designations, namely the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, which has established the Kármán line at an altitude of 62 miles as a working definition for the boundary between aeronautics and astronautics. This is used because at an altitude of about 62 miles, as Theodore von Kármán calculated, a vehicle would have to travel faster than orbital velocity to derive sufficient aerodynamic lift from the atmosphere to support itself. Up until 2021, the United States designated people who travel above an altitude of 50 miles as astronauts. Astronaut wings are now only awarded to spacecraft crew members who demonstrated activities during flight that were essential to public safety or contributed to human space flight safety. Also a bit vague, especially for the government. And contributing to human space flight safety is even more vague. That could be everything from testing a new, more efficient spacesuit to investigating a comet that consists of an unusually high amount of dark matter. Anyway, NASA's space shuttle used 75.76 miles as its re-entry altitude, termed the entry interface, which roughly marks the boundary where atmospheric drag becomes noticeable, thus beginning the process of switching from steering with thrusters to maneuvering with aerodynamic control surfaces. In 2009, scientists reported detailed measurements with a suprathermal ion imager, which is an instrument that measures the direction and speed of ions, which allowed them to establish a boundary at 73.3 miles above the Earth. The boundary represents the midpoint of a gradual transition from the relative gentle winds of the Earth's atmosphere to the more violent flows of charged particles in space, which can reach speeds well over 880 feet per second. Therefore, by definition for spaceflight to occur, sufficient altitude is necessary. This implies that a minimum effort of gravitational potential energy needs to be overcome. But that's just a theory on paper. In practice, an even higher amount of energy than that is needed to be expended due to losses such as air drag, propulsive efficiency, and cycle efficiency of the engines that are employed. Oh, and we can't forget about gravity drag either. Now, none of this applies to us, but I just thought you might like to have a little bit of history here. In the past 50 years or so, spaceflight has usually meant remaining in space for a period of time, rather than going up and immediately falling back to Earth. This entails orbit, which is mostly a matter of velocity, not altitude, although that does not mean air friction and relevant altitudes don't have to be taken into account. At much, much higher altitudes than many orbital ones maintained by satellites, altitude begins to become a larger and larger factor, and speed a lesser one. At lower altitudes, due to the high speed required to remain in orbit, air friction is a very important consideration affecting satellites, much more than in the popular image of space. Interestingly, at even lower altitudes, balloons with no forward velocity can serve many of the roles satellites play, and of course are considerably cheaper. Now, I thought about all this as we sat in the private car NASA sent for us in the morning. We were able to use special Los Angeles NASA government routes, so there was no traffic. Bradley and Dolores held hands, and we were all smiles in anticipation as we approached the secret launch pad and rocket gantry at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. The crew met us there. They were all on time, of course, as NASA had sent a car for each and every crew member. I mean, you can't delay a rocket launch because someone is stuck in traffic on the 134. As a precaution, everyone would be in full spacesuit gear during the launch for an added layer of safety and redundancy. All the spacesuits had extra life sign monitoring equipment and would give ground control an added level of data monitoring Janet had insisted on. It was clear NASA wanted to leave nothing to chance. Something as a scientist I appreciated, even though I did prefer my space launches sans full spacesuit, but it was a minor inconvenience. Once we were out of Earth's orbit, we were free to move about the cabin and remove the spacesuits. My friend Professor Armstrong met us at the gantry and was in charge of the launch team. Unfortunately, there was no time to visit the White Dwarf coffee shop at the top this time, and we had a schedule to keep. There was activity at every inch of JPL as everyone prepared for the launch. A few Space Force colonels were there in attendance, talking to mission specialist Janet. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but it looked like Dolores did and seemed to be taking some mental notes. Everyone had their duties and responsibilities, and the Journeyman was a hive of activity. Last-minute preparations and inspections were being carried out as we all manned our launch stations. I saw Bradley give Dolores' hand one final squeeze while they were both in their spacesuits to reassure her and let her know that she could overcome her astrophobia. But soon it was time to get into our individual launch stations and strap in. The countdown would soon begin, and we would be off into outer space on our way to Mars to untold adventure. Just before launch, I was thinking of the physics of it all. You see, if the Earth's gravity is to be overcome entirely, then sufficient energy must be obtained by a spacecraft to exceed the depth of the potential energy well. Once this has occurred, provided the energy is not lost in any non-conservative way, then the vehicle will leave the influence of the Earth. The depth of the potential well depends on the vehicle position, and the energy depends on the vehicle's speed. Now, if the kinetic energy exceeds the potential energy, then escape occurs. At the Earth's surface, this occurs at a speed of 25,000 miles per hour, but again, in practice, a much higher speed is needed due to air drag. Now, this wasn't our first rodeo, and the Journeyman had more than enough power, or oomph, as Bradley called it, to leave the influence of the Earth. This is a really interesting turn of phrase, to leave the influence of the Earth. It makes you wonder if we'd all be better off leaving the influence of the Earth now and again. I always say, sometimes adventure brings together strange bedfellows like science and philosophy. But science and philosophy seem to be in a long-term relationship and see each other more often than you'd think. Now, larger rockets, but still smaller than the Journeyman, are normally launched from a launch pad that provides stable support until a few seconds after ignition. Due to their high exhaust philosophy, like 5,600 to 10,100 miles per hour, rockets are particularly useful when very high speeds are required, such as orbital speed at approximately 17,000 miles per hour. Spacecraft delivered into orbital trajectories become artificial satellites, which are used for many commercial purposes. Indeed, rockets remain the only way to launch spacecraft into orbit and beyond. They are also used to rapidly accelerate spacecraft when they change orbits or deorbit for landing. Also, a rocket may be used to soften a hard parachute landing immediately before touchdown. In other words, a retro rocket. Now, the Journeyman has its own customized re-entry procedure, and I'll explain that at a later time. Everyone was in launch position and the rocket gantry had retracted. It was time for the launch countdown. Now, a lot of people ask me about the details of a space launch countdown, so I thought I would tell you a little bit about it. A countdown is a carefully devised set of procedures ending with the ignition of a rocket's engine. Depending on the type of vehicle used, the countdowns can start from 72 to 96 hours before launch time. During countdown, a number of important things happen. Aerospace personnel bring the rocket vehicle to the launch site and load it with payload and propellants. Launch center computers communicate with sensors in the rocket, which monitor important systems on the launch vehicle and payload. Launch personnel monitor the weather and wait for the launch window. Security personnel prevent unauthorized persons from entering the keep out areas. The procedures for each launch are written carefully. For the space shuttle, a 5-volume set, Shuttle Countdown KSC S0007 was used. Rosie Carver, a technical writer for United Launch Alliance, has created at least 15,000 procedures for more than 300 missions since the Solar Maximum mission, which launched February 14th in 1980. Now, these documents are living documents, which reflect new issues and solutions as they develop. Each mission requires approximately 100 procedure books. Now, we had considerably less with the Journeyman, as our systems were a bit more advanced and some of the procedures were combined or automated. Proceeding with the countdown depends on several factors, such as the proper launch window, weather that permits a safe launch, and the rocket and payload working properly. Now, there was only one of those issues I was worried about, and it was, of course, the weather. The storm front was moving closer, but we were still on track to beat it with our launch window. The thing I was trying to avoid was a hold. A hold is the suspension of the normal countdown process. This can be done to investigate a technical process that has gone wrong, or because of marginal weather at the launch pad. Some holds are planned. They are done so the launch support computers can run automatic checks on the rocket. Under some circumstances, a countdown may be recycled to an earlier time. When that happens, launch personnel begin following the countdown checklist from an earlier point. In the context of a rocket launch, the L- time is the physical time before launch. For example, L- 3 minutes and 40 seconds. T- time is a system to mark points at which actions necessary for the launch are planned. T- time stops and starts as various hold points are entered, so it doesn't show the actual time to launch. The last 10 seconds are usually counted down aloud. 10 seconds to liftoff, 9, 8, 7, so you get the idea. And that's the part of the countdown launch you always see on TV shows and movies. After a launch, most countdown clocks begin to show mission elapsed time, which is typically shown as T+. Now, I took this time to ask Janet, the mission specialist, about what she needed to tell me about the mission. Granted, it wasn't the most opportune time, but if it was important, I wanted to hear about it as soon as possible. Janet took a deep breath and looked like she was about to tell me at least part of the classified information that was supposed to wait until we were spacebound. But before she could speak, a warning light started to flash with a gentle yet persistent beep. It was a hold. We were all set to launch, but something had happened. Suddenly, as I feared, the T- time halted and we were on an official hold. This was not scheduled, so I unstrapped and immediately went to the observation deck of the Journeyman. I didn't need to wait for ground control to give me an explanation. I already knew what the problem was. The storm front had moved in much more quickly than anticipated and was heading right for the launch pad. Professor Armstrong was already calling, and he was about to tell me they would need to postpone the mission, and it was a strong storm front expected to last for the better part of a week. I could see the disappointed looks on the crew's faces as they learned what was happening. A week delay was unacceptable. We had to get out into space, and I had to get to my son. There was a time for proper preparation, and then there's a time to be bold. Adventurers need to know when to step back, but they also need to know when to take a bold step forward against the odds. Professor Armstrong was about to make the announcement about postponing the launch when I stopped him. It was time for me to activate that standby favor, and that favor would be from Professor Felice, who I had contacted and put on standby for just such an emergency. I called him and coordinated with NASA. He was already prepped and ready and would be there in 2 hours with what we needed. As you remember from our alternate universe Madagascar adventure, Professor Felice powered his Maelstrom wormhole generator with a storm harvesting system. It would collect enough power to generate a Maelstrom wormhole, but we had also discussed other uses for it, and as of last night, we were about to put one of them into practice. We discussed using the energy harvesting in a more symmetrical pattern, which would harvest the storm energy and then simultaneously release it in the same area. This would create an ongoing storm force dampening field as long as the storm kept powering it. The energy would be harvested and released in a circular pattern. The goal was to create an artificial storm eye. Now, I wasn't sure of the applications at the time, but now I know one such application would be to artificially create an eye of a storm with calm enough weather that you could facilitate a rocket launch into outer space. Professor Felice and his team burned the midnight oil and made the necessary modifications last night. I had looped Professor Armstrong in to facilitate the logistics of Professor Felice bringing his system in on such short notice. Professor Felice arrived a few minutes early with his entire system, and with JPL's help, it was soon in place around the launch pad. Professor Felice powered on his energy harvesting system, now modified for storm eye generation, without a wormhole, of course, and the results were almost immediate. His modified system created an artificial calm weather eye around the launch pad. We all smiled and let out a sigh of relief. We would be able to take off in the middle of the storm. It wouldn't hold for long, so we had to be quick about it. We would then gain enough velocity to break through the storm and rise above it. After the cheers and hoots and hollers from both inside the Journeyman and ground control died down, Professor Armstrong resumed the countdown. Just like that, we were on our way. Professor Felice's modified storm energy harvesting system had worked. And let me just add, it's not often you're in a rocket ship blasting off into space and also in a thunderstorm. But the point was, they were now a safe distance apart so as to allow our launch into space. I will admit, it was an odd sensation, listening to the rocket engines, but also hearing a thunderstorm half a mile away in every direction. The eye gave us plenty of room and provided us with safe weather conditions in which to launch, but to actually experience it firsthand and be in the center of it was another story indeed. The whole crew felt calm, including Dolores, and the storm had a grounding effect and kept us centered as we launched into the upper atmosphere. We wouldn't be in the custom eye of the storm for long, as we would soon be far above the storm and soon into the vastness of outer space. But I took a deep breath and enjoyed the moment. We had made it successfully into outer space and were headed to Mars. The crew let out another cheer as we began our journey, and I will tell you all about it next time. But before I end this evening's story, I want to talk to you about something. We were in outer space, heading for adventure, and launching in the eye of the storm seemed fitting and appropriate. It was unexpected, to be sure, but most things in life are. Life is filled with unexpected events, both good and bad, and there's no way you can prepare for all of them. Now, this time I did know the storm was a possibility, so I put together a contingency plan with Professor Felice in case we needed it. And while on this topic, the truth is, it was one unexpected event after another when we met up with Professor Felice, from the wormhole maelstrom to a dimension without cheese. But I wouldn't have been able to circumvent the storm and be in outer space without Professor Felice's help. I would have had to wait at least another week, and that was not something I was willing to do. The point is not that I needed help, because I did. The point is that help was available. Science is all about development, but developing friendships and work relationships are equally important. You need to be ready to help people when they are in need, just as much as you need to put your ego aside when you need to ask for it yourself. Professor Felice and I worked together to be able to return to our own dimension, and I also helped him years back with a thorny problem involving a sunken ruin, a territorial sea turtle, and a very shy merman. That's a story for another time, but the point is, I was happy to help, and I didn't do it so he could help me later on. You help people because they need it, not because you're keeping a ledger. And the truth is, you don't have to. Help will come back to you when you need it most anyway. So keep helping people, and don't be afraid to ask for help. The universal scientific principles of help and need will usually balance out for both the helper and the helpee, no matter which side you're currently on. Good night, adventurers.
The Quiet Journeys of Professor Atwood was created, written, and performed by Chris Mancini and produced by White Cat Entertainment. It is a work of fiction. Maybe. Music and sound design by Ron Tansky at rontanskymusic.com. For more info and merchandise, including t-shirts, mugs, and blankets, go to whitecatentertainment.com.